Welcome to Chapter 4, everybody. I hope this chapter will be shorter, and it's the last one before your first exam. So it's all about tissues. We learned before that there are different levels of organization, starting off at the chemical level, and chemicals combine to form cells, or molecules combine to form cells, and then cells combine to form tissues. So cells working together form a tissue. And there are four basic tissue types. First, epithelial tissue, and they all have a C function that I remember. So epithelial covers, then connective connects, and we're going to talk about each one of these in detail later on. Then muscle contracts, and then for neural tissue, its C function is conduct, or you could say communicate. Now, in order to study a tissue, we need a microscope. This picture is kind of cool. It shows what we can see. A human is a little more than 1 meter. Some of us are almost 2. And it shows what we can see with the human eye. So we can see our finger. We can see down to some of the largest single-celled organisms we can barely see. When you get down to human cells, we need a microscope. So things in this range, you need a light microscope to see. That's the cheapest kind of microscope. Scanning electron microscopes, you can see even smaller things, and with a transmission electron microscope, you can see even smaller things. We're not worried about those smaller things for this class, so a light microscope is good enough for this class. But as you get better microscopes, you can see smaller things and see finer details and learn more about things. Alright, and so here's a tissue under a light microscope. So with a transmission electron microscope, you see even better details. You see the organelles inside the cells. And then with a scanning electron microscope, now we can see the cilia really well. You can see the magnification is a lot higher. Alright, let's talk about tissues. First, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue covers surfaces, it lines structures, and it forms secretory glands. So they can be epithelia, which are lining and covering, or glands, and they can be exocrine or endocrine glands. And there are four basic functions of epithelial tissue. One is physical protection. Another thing they do is control permeability. A lot of diffusion happens through epithelial tissue. Another thing they do is provide sensation. So our skin is actually epithelial tissue. And then some epithelial tissues produce specialized secretions. Now, all epithelial tissue has what's called an apical surface, which is at the top in this figure. That faces the exterior of the body or some internal space, and then a base, or in this picture it's called the basolateral surface, which is attached to adjacent tissues. We name epithelial tissues by their shape and by the number of layers. So squamous tissue is flat, like this right here. Cuboidal tissue is cube-shaped, and columnar tissue is tall. It looks like a rectangle under the microscope. And then it can also be simple. If there's one layer of cells, it's called simple, like these up on top. And if there are multiple layers, like these on the bottom, it's called stratified. So stratified is multiple layers. And we'll notice with the epithelial tissue, there's lots of tightly packed cells. Okay, epithelial tissues are very tightly packed cells, and they're also very tightly connected, and there are some specialized structures that allow this to happen. And we're going to look closer at some of those. So this is a hemidesmosome, which would connect the base of the epithelial tissue to the basement membrane. This would be called a tight junction, and these form a very tight barrier that not even water can get through. This is an adhesion belt, which strengthens the apical region, prevents distortion or leakage there. This is a gap junction, which is a functional connection. It allows ions to pass through in between adjacent cells, and we'll actually see these more in muscle cells than in epithelial cells. We'll talk more about them later. Then this is a desmosome, which forms a very tight junction. You can see these red fibers are representing the cytoskeleton of this cell on the right, and these are the cytoskeleton of the cell on the left. And these things are called cell adhesion molecules, so they connect the cytoskeleton of one cell with the cytoskeleton of the next cell, so that makes a very strong connection. Alright, next type of, we're going to start talking about the type of tissues now. So this is a squamous epithelium, and it has very flat cells. They're found in regions where absorption or diffusion takes place, or where there are slick surfaces that reduce friction. So this is showing here the mesothelium. It's a very thin membrane that lines the abdominal cavity and prevents friction. There's also one around the heart. There's also one around the lungs. You would also see this type of tissue in the lungs and lining blood vessels, allowing for diffusion. Because the cells are so thin, diffusion can happen very, very rapidly. Okay, next type of epithelium. This is stratified squamous epithelium. And it's found where there would be chemical or mechanical stress, such as this is from the tongue or the lining of the mouth. Also, areas like the anus and the vagina they're subject to stress, so they are covered by stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Then on exposed body surfaces like the skin, there's a special type of stratified squamous tissue called keratinized. And this is a close-up on the keratin fibers. They give skin its strength, and they also make it waterproof, and that prevents dehydration. Okay, next type. This tissue has square-looking cells, so it's cuboidal, and there's one layer, so it's simple cuboidal. And these look like they're from kidney tubules. So this is simple cuboidal. They're found where secretion and absorption takes place, such as the kidney tubules. Here there are two layers of cuboidal cells, so that would be stratified cuboidal epithelium, and we see it in sweat glands and also in mammary glands. Another type is transitional epithelium, and this type can be stretched, so we see it in the bladder. Next we have simple columnar epithelium, found where absorption or secretion takes place. It's just showing it in the small intestine. In the small intestine, it's covered with these microvilli, which increase the surface area. Then we have what's called pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and we see this lining the nasal cavity and the trachea, and it's covered with mucus, and it's also covered with cilia that can move things away from the lungs. So this is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It provides protection and it contains cilia. Then very rarely we see stratified columnar epithelium. We see it lining some ducts, such as in the salivary gland and in the pancreas. And then we have glandular epithelium, which are specialized for secretion. So the first type of secretion is shown here. It's called merocrine secretion. This is how our salivary glands work. The product is produced in these vesicles, and these vesicles, they release their product by exocytosis. The next type of secretion is called apocrine. This is what we see in the mammary glands, where a segment of the cytoplasm will just break off and the product is contained in it. And then that will regrow, and then it will start to pinch off, and it keeps repeating that cycle. That's apocrine secretion. And then in holocrine secretion, which we see in these sebaceous glands, or oil glands in our skin, the whole cell is going to fill up with the secretory product, which in this case is an oil-like substance. And then the whole cell is going to lyse and burst and release the contents and kill the cell. So that's holocrine secretion. Now, exocrine glands can be classified as simple or compound, as well as tubular or alveolar. So these are all simple glands, meaning there's no branches. Tubular means they form a tube. Or sorry, let's look at a compound one first. A compound gland forms several branches. Then a simple gland can be tubular, where it forms a simple tube, or alveolar, where it forms a sac. And then there are also some single cells that act as glands. These are mucus or goblet cells, and they release mucin, which forms mucus. Alright, so that's epithelial tissue. Next tissue type is called connective. And connective tissue contains cells in a matrix composed of extracellular protein fibers and fluid. So with epithelial, we had lots of cells. With connective, there's lots of extracellular fibers. Sometimes it's liquid. And there are some basic functions of connective tissue. First, it establishes a structural framework for the body. Another function is transporting fluids and dissolved materials. That's the function of the blood, which we'll talk about. Another function is protecting delicate organs. It supports, surrounds, and interconnects other types of tissue. It stores energy. And then it defends the body from invaders. This is areolar tissue, which is the most common form of connective tissue in adults. And you can see there's lots of fibers. The three fiber types are reticular, which is this branch tissue that provides a supportive framework. Then collagen fibers add a lot of strength. And then elastic fibers are stretchy. So depending on the ratio of these different fibers, that will determine the properties of the tissue. It also consists of different cell types. There are fixed cells, and they're involved in maintenance and repair of the local area. And then the wandering cells, like here's some wandering cells, and they're more involved with the body's defense system. We'll talk about them more with the immune system. So some types of connective tissue. Adipose tissue provides padding and stores energy. We do need some adipose tissue. It's fat. Most people have too much, though. This is reticular tissue. You can see the branched fibers. It's found in soft tissues where it forms a tough, flexible network to provide support and resist distortion. Then the next type would be dense connective tissues. Dense connective tissues consist mostly of extracellular fibers. And this first type is known as dense regular connective tissue. And so we would see this in tendons and ligaments. It's very strong and it's very good at resisting stress that comes from one direction. The next type is dense irregular connective tissue. And it can withstand stress from many different directions, but it's not as strong as the regular connective tissue. One place we see it is in the skin. And then we also have elastic tissue. Elastic tissue is mostly elastic fibers, and it's found in areas that need to repeatedly stretch and recoil, such as this connection here between the vertebrae. Then the only fluid connective tissue is the blood, which consists of these cells called the formed elements, and then the plasma, which is mostly water. And we'll learn all about blood next semester. Okay. Then cartilage provides us a flexible support for body structures. The first type we're going to look at is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is found covering bone surfaces and in the trachea. It provides stiff but somewhat flexible support and reduces friction between bony surfaces, so we'll see it on the ends of our bones, making it so there's no friction in our joints. The next type we want to talk about is elastic cartilage. It has a lot of elastic tissue, and so it's more flexible. One thing it does is form our external ear. And then the next type is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is extremely durable. It's found in the intervertebral discs. It has a lot of strong collagen fibers. And cartilage can grow a couple of ways. The first way is called appositional growth. Cartilage is usually covered by the perichondrium, which gives support and protection. And it can grow by appositional growth, where you're adding new layers. Or it can also grow by interstitial growth, where the cartilage is growing within by cells within it, dividing and pushing outwards. And we'll talk more about that later on in the course. Next tissue type is bone. Bone provides a very strong framework for the body, and we'll talk all about bone in Chapter 6. And this chart compares cartilage and bone. Another picture of bone. Next topic is membranes. Membranes are physical barriers. There are 4 types of membranes you should know. Mucous membranes, like this one here, are lined with mucus. They line passageways and chambers that communicate with the exterior, like the digestive and the respiratory tract. Then the next type is a serous membrane. Serous membranes line body cavities and prevent friction. And the cutaneous membrane is our skin. Covers the surface of the body and provides protection. And then synovial membranes line joint cavities, and we'll talk more about them in Chapter 8. And then we also have fascia. Fascia create internal compartments and divisions. And it's generally made up of connective tissue. Alright, next tissue type is muscle. If we look at the weights, about half of the weight of our body comes from muscle tissues, 45% from connective, 30% from epithelial, and 1-2% from neural tissue. And as we said earlier, muscle tissue contracts, and there are 3 types. First, skeletal muscle attaches to our bones, and it's consciously controlled, or we say it's voluntary. Then cardiac muscle is found in the heart, and we'll learn more about it actually next semester. Smooth muscle is found in our hollow organs, like in the digestive tract and in blood vessels. It's involuntary, and we'll learn about it more next semester also. Then neural tissue, this is a neuron. Neural tissue communicates and sends signals throughout the body. And main neural tissue is the neuron. We're going to learn all about it in chapter 11. And then there are also neuroglia, which protect and support the neurons. We'll learn more about them in chapter 11. And in response to an injury, as we're exposed to pathogens or toxins, mast cells are activated, and they release their histamine, and this is going to cause inflammation. And the inflammation is going to increase the blood flow, and that's going to bring in oxygen and nutrients that are needed for repair. It's also going to bring in white blood cells that can get rid of our toxins and wastes. And it causes pain, unfortunately, but it is a good thing. And then over time, the damaged tissue is repaired. We call this regeneration, and we're good as new. And that is the end of chapter 4.